Catelyn Stark never forgot the smell of blood. Long after she had fled that wretched night, it stayed with her in her waking hours and haunted her dreams. She had grown up among lords and ladies, learned the ways of courtesy, duty, and loyalty. Yet no training prepared one for a slaughter so sudden, so brutal, so heartbreakingly final. The Red Wedding was meant to seal alliances and secure victory. Instead, it took from her all that she held dear. Her son Robb, her hope for the North, and for a time, her very will to live. She was never quite sure how she managed to escape. Memory played cruel tricks on her. Sometimes she thought she recalled every detail with razor-sharp clarity. Walder Frey's mocking grin, the sound of crossbow bolts whistling through the air, the shrieks of the dying, the choking sobs that she herself had loosed as she watched her son collapse. Other times, there was only a haze of confusion. She remembered the thunder of music twisting into something violent and discordant. She remembered the table shaking beneath her as men stumbled and died. She remembered tearing at her face in grief, her nails drawing blood from her own cheeks. And then, nothingness. And yet here she was, alive in the Riverlands, standing knee-deep in a cold stream, her skirt pulled up to her calves, washing her hands over and over as though she might scrub away the memory of that night. She had run on numb legs or had been carried, perhaps by some last loyal soldier, or by instincts older and darker than reason. She awakened at dawn, alone and soaked in her own dried blood as well as others, in a small copse of trees by the tumblestone. The sky was gray, the morning air chill, and she lay there for a long time, half convinced she had passed into the afterlife. But life called her back, though she knew not for what purpose. Robb was gone. The king in the north, her eldest boy, butchered by Freys and Bolton men. Her brother Edmure was a hostage, or worse. Her daughters. Sansa was in King's Landing, a prisoner of the Lannisters, and Arya. No one knew. Bran and Rickon she had last heard were dead or missing, and her husband was only bones somewhere beneath the ground. The House of Stark had been dismantled piece by piece, and she felt as if her own soul had been battered into dust. She feared the eyes of men, for if any recognized her, they would name her Catelyn Tully, the traitor's mother, the woman who had raised a rebel king. That was how the Freys and the Lannisters would paint her in the stories. Or they might call her the maddened mother, if they believed her mind had broken at the Red Wedding. Yet something stronger burned in her than shame or madness, an urge to find justice. This was the Riverlands, her family's land. Her father was dead, Riverrun was captured, but still, her blood belonged here. She could move secretly, for who would look for a dead woman scuttling through the shadows? She told herself her first goal was survival. Find food, find refuge, find clothing that did not smell of gore. But in truth, it was not merely survival she clung to. She thirsted for vengeance. She did not know how she, alone and near-broken, could bring ruin upon House Frey or House Bolton. But every breath she took fanned the embers of her anger. The Red Wedding was a betrayal, an atrocity so vile it blackened the names of all who participated. She would not let them go unpunished, not while there was breath in her body. The day after she washed the grime of the twins from her body in that icy stream, she stole a peasant woman's cloak off a scarecrow. There was nothing else to clothe it but ragged cloth, and the crow had done its work well enough. Wrapped in the coarse cloak, she trudged along muddy roads, fighting the pangs of hunger. She found a half-burned farmstead that smelled of smoke and old ash, rummaged for stale bread, ate half and carried the rest with her. Her feet ached. Her ribs jutted painfully under her gown, but she pressed on. She told herself that each step carried her farther from that massacre. No one who passed by guessed that beneath the hood was the Lady of Winterfell and once Lady of Riverrun. She kept her face in shadow, speaking little. If folk offered a good day, she might incline her head. She avoided bands of soldiers and outlaws, for the Riverlands were plagued by both. The war had ravaged the countryside. Wolves prowled in the forests, and worse men prowled on the roads. Everywhere she went, she found burnt fields, empty villages, terrified small folk with nothing left to give. She passed them with pity in her heart, but fear as well. She could not help them. She had nothing herself. Some nights she slept by the roadside, listening to the hoot of owls and rustle of animals in the undergrowth, the wind soughing in trees that bore silent witness to her tragedy. She thought often of her children, Rob most of all. She could still feel his blood on her hands, see his eyes clouding over in that final moment. Her heart twisted with renewed anguish each time. But along with the grief came renewed fury, a resolve that she would avenge him or die in the attempt. On a late afternoon, the sky threatened rain, and she found a ruin sept by a deserted hamlet. The roof had collapsed in places, the doors were splintered, and the mosaic floors were covered in weeds. She intended to take shelter in one corner that still stood mostly intact. But as she approached, she heard a faint shuffle inside. Drawing back, she pressed herself against the mossy wall, startled that she had almost stumbled upon someone unprepared. She heard voices low and weary. A man said, "We can rest here a bit before nightfall. No one comes here." A woman's voice answered, "I hope they do not. If we're found, we'll be robbed again or worse." Catelyn peered around the crumbling stone to see a pair of small folk, a husband and wife by the look of them. Their clothes were tattered, faces gaunt from hunger. The man had a donkey with him, loaded with straw bedding and a single sack. They did not look like bandits, but there was always a risk. She considered turning away to find another place. But a wave of exhaustion reminded her how far she had walked. If she could share the space without threat, it would be better than sleeping in the rain. She forced her trembling fingers not to shake as she emerged from hiding. She kept her hood low, but made her steps obvious. The couple startled, the woman clutching her husband's arm. "Good day," Catelyn said softly. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears. It had been so long since she had spoken more than a word or two. "I seek shelter for the night. I mean you no harm." The man eyed her suspiciously, but then he seemed to take in her ragged appearance, the hollow look in her eyes. She looked nothing like a lady, more like a wandering beggar or a mother who had lost everything. Well, it's a free sept, or was," he said. "We'll not drive you away, so long as you keep the peace." She inclined her head in thanks and found herself a spot against a partially intact wall, a few paces away from them. The donkey stomped a foot, restless. The couple murmured to each other. After a time, the woman came near. "We've a bit of salt pork if you'd like a slice. Small thanks to the gods that we made it this far." Catelyn hesitated. She wanted to refuse out of pride, for the Tully in her bristled at accepting charity from strangers. But she was hungry, and any scraps were precious. "Thank you," she managed, her voice hoarse. She took the slice the woman offered and chewed it slowly, savoring the salt and the meager fat. The couple introduced themselves as Merritt and Lena, small folk fleeing the chaos of the Frey's retribution after the wedding. They had lost their home in the crossfire of the war. Catelyn listened to their hardships, barely speaking beyond a few nods and murmured condolences. They spoke of how the Freys had men roaming the roads, looking for outlaws, looking for stragglers from the northern armies who had not died at the Twins. They spoke of how the Blackfish, Catelyn's uncle Brynden Tully, still held out at Riverrun, defiant as ever. Word was that House Frey had demanded his surrender, but he would not yield. The noose was tightening around Riverrun, though. Many small folk were fleeing to the woods or heading south to find safer lands, if such a place still existed. War might have slowed in some theaters, but the Riverlands still bled. Catelyn absorbed the news like dry earth soaks up rain. Her uncle was still alive, still resisting. That thought stirred a flicker of hope in her chest. If Brynden Tully could remain defiant, so could she. But she kept her true identity hidden, for to reveal herself would only endanger these people and put her at risk. She thanked them quietly for the pork, then turned aside to rest. The night was windy, but the walls shielded them from the worst of it. Catelyn dozed lightly, roused by any noise, her dreams filled with images of the twins. At daybreak, she awoke to find the couple packing their donkey. They offered to share their route for a ways, but she politely declined. She was safer alone, so they parted without ceremony, and she started on her solitary path once more. Days bled into weeks as she wandered, living off scraps and what she could barter or beg. She discovered that a tattered cloak and lowered gaze shielded her from curious eyes better than armor. Ragged women were not uncommon in these war-torn lands, and few guessed she had once been the Lady of Riverrun. Though the phrase might have men searching for any highborn survivors, they expected to find lords, knights, or men-at-arms. A silent, half-broken woman drew little interest unless she was alone on a dark road, which, of course, she often was. But the gods seemed to guard her steps for a time. One evening, while she was hunting for a stream to wash her face, she heard raucous laughter from down the road. 3 men rode up on horses, bearing mismatched armor. She froze, cursing her own carelessness for being in the open, but it was too late to hide. They spied her at once. One of them nudged his companion and whispered something. Another laughed. Catelyn stood her ground, head bowed. Fear thrummed in her veins, but she forced herself to remain still. She had no weapon but a small knife she'd found on a corpse days ago. These men were likely outlaws or brigands, which the Riverlands had in plague proportions. "Hold there, girl," one man called. "What's your name? You traveling alone?" She murmured something unintelligible, kept her hood low, and pretended she had trouble speaking. She remembered her mother once telling her how to feign muteness if it might keep ill-intentioned men at bay. But these men did not appear to be easily fooled. One slid off his horse and approached. He stank of sweat and ale. Catelyn's knuckles went white around the small knife hidden in her cloak. "Don't be shy," he said, leering as he grabbed at her hood. She tried to jerk away, but he was faster and stronger. He pulled the cloth from her head, revealing her face. She gasped, her pale skin marred by the scabs of self-inflicted scratches. Her auburn hair, once so carefully kept, was tangled and dull, streaked with white from dust and time. Her eyes burned with hatred. "7 hells," the man said, squinting. "You're older than I thought, and with those scars, gods. I thought we found some fresh young thing." He made a face. "Don't look like you've got much coin on you." Another one chimed in from atop his horse. "We can still have fun with her, Willem. She might have something hidden under them skirts. Maybe she's got family with coin somewhere." Catelyn's heart pounded. She tried to keep her face impassive, to appear worthless to them, but she saw the hungry gleam in their eyes that told her they might try to take more than her money. They were 3. She was 1 and near-starved. The fear was choking, but deeper still was her fury. She had lost everything at the Red Wedding. She would not lose her dignity at the hands of these brutes. "Let me be," she said, managing to keep her voice steady. "I have nothing of value." The man called Willem laughed. "I'll be the judge of that," he said, and reached out. His hand gripped her arm, fingers digging into her flesh. The stench of ale wafted from his breath. "Stop struggling, old woman." Time slowed. She recalled the wedding hall at the twins, the crossbows, the maddening shriek of steel on steel, and how she had been helpless. Not again. She had a blade now. She was no warrior, but desperation lent her strength. In a single motion, she drove the point of her hidden knife into the man's thigh. He howled, staggering backward. Blood trickled through his breeches. She tore free, fully expecting the other 2 to come at her. Indeed, one spurred his horse forward, but in the confusion, the horse reared, and the man had to struggle to keep his seat. The 3rd man scrambled off his horse, cursing. Catelyn ran, but she only got a few paces before the 2nd man tackled her from behind. She hit the ground hard, the air knocked out of her lungs. The knife slipped from her hand and skittered across the dirt. She struggled, kicking and biting, but the man pinned her arms. Willem was stumbling toward them, bleeding. He had murder in his eyes. "Slit her throat," he snarled. "She cut me. The bitch cut me." The man atop her reached for his dagger. She thrashed, spitting in his face, fighting with every ounce of her fading strength, but it felt futile. Her mind reeled. If she died here, her vengeance would die with her. She cried out hoarsely, not expecting any help to come. Then a shadow fell across them. She heard a snarl, then a dull thud as the weight on her back was suddenly lifted. She rolled over, gasping, to see that another figure had come out of the fading daylight, tall, wiry, with a hood drawn tight around his face. He'd smashed the brigand's head with the hilt of a sword. The man slumped, dazed. Willem, seeing the newcomer, swore and lurched forward, but the hooded stranger danced aside with uncanny agility. A flash of steel, and Willem's throat opened in a spray of red. He crumpled, choking on his own blood. The third brigand saw his comrades fall and turned his horse to flee, spurring it into a gallop. The hooded stranger made no move to chase. Catelyn lay on the ground, panting, her limbs trembling. Her rescuer stood over the unconscious or dying man, sword in hand. The man tried to reach for a weapon, but the figure kicked it away. Catelyn watched in a kind of numb shock as the stranger ended his life swiftly, a single thrust that stilled any further struggle. In the hush that followed, the only sound was Catelyn's ragged breathing. The hooded figure turned toward her. She stiffened, not sure if she had found a friend or merely a new threat. The sword hung easily in the stranger's grip. Slowly, the figure lowered the blade and drew back the hood, revealing the narrow face of a woman. Pale, with short-cropped dark hair and keen gray eyes. The face was unfamiliar to Catelyn. The woman's expression was grim, yet not unkind. "You're no peasant," the woman said, eyeing Catelyn's posture, the way she had tried to fight. "You fight with the desperation of someone with a purpose. Who are you?" Catelyn swallowed painfully, tasting blood in her mouth. Her cheek was scraped. "I am no one," she managed. "Thank you for helping me." The woman wiped her sword on a scrap of cloth. "You're a fool to wander these roads alone. The Riverlands are full of filth these days." She extended a hand. Catelyn hesitated, then accepted it, allowing the stranger to pull her to her feet. "Can you walk?" Catelyn tested her weight on her ankles. They ached, but she could stand. "Yes," she said. "I have a camp not far from here. Are you hungry? I've food enough for the night." It was dangerous to trust a stranger, but no more dangerous than staying there with two corpses cooling in the dirt. "Thank you," she said again, and followed the woman. They left the scene quickly, lest the third brigand return with reinforcements. The woman led Catelyn along a winding path, over a small ridge, and into a thicket of trees. There, a hidden hollow held a small fire pit, a horse tethered to a low branch, and a neat arrangement of saddlebags. A bedroll lay near the ash of an old fire. Catelyn lowered herself gingerly near a log. Her savior poured water from a skin into a tin cup, handing it to her. She drank gratefully. The woman studied her, eyes flicking over the scratch marks on her face, her tangled hair, the hollow of her cheeks. Then, she produced a small chunk of hard bread and a bit of cheese, offering them in silence. Catelyn ate in small, careful bites. After a time, the woman spoke. "You owe me answers, traveler. I don't kill men out of kindness. That was no random rescue. I hate seeing scum like that tormenting the helpless. But I don't trust easily." Catelyn's gaze flicked up. "I understand. My name is Cat. I was traveling with my son's army, but after the defeat, I was left adrift." It was not a complete lie, but neither was it the entire truth. She watched the woman's expression carefully, but saw no immediate recognition. Perhaps the name Cat was too plain to conjure memories of Catelyn Stark. That was well. "And your purpose?" the woman asked. "Where are you heading?" "Nowhere," Catelyn said softly. "Every place is dangerous." Her tone was bleak. "You're one to speak of trust, but I know nothing of you." The woman let a small smile curve her lips, but it carried no warmth. "I am called Thora," she said, though Catelyn guessed it might be as false as the name she had given. "I have my own reasons for traveling alone. Let's leave it at that for now. Are you certain you weren't part of the Red Wedding fiasco? I've come across more than a few survivors, though none as solitary as you." Catelyn felt her heart stutter. She clutched the tin cup more tightly, hoping her face did not betray her. "I was lucky not to be there," she lied. "I heard what happened, The slaughter. She let out a shuddering breath for authenticity, though her grief was quite real. I lost friends. Thora nodded, either believing her or choosing not to press. I've heard the phrase are scouring these lands for any remaining loyalists to the king in the north. They can't abide the notion that some might seek vengeance. Are you loyal to the Stark cause? A flicker of fierce pride flared in Catelyn's chest. She forced her voice to remain steady. I served them, and I do not forget the good they have done. But King Robb is dead. The cause is lost. Thora studied her for a moment, then said, There are always those who resist. Perhaps the cause is battered but not lost. I've heard rumors of northern men who slipped away before the massacre, forming hidden camps. Some talk of taking a bloody toll on any Frey patrols. Others speak of forging a path home. War is not finished in the Riverlands, for good or ill. Catelyn listened, her mouth set in a thin line. If there were any northern soldiers left, they might be the key to vengeance. But she did not yet trust Thora enough to reveal her intentions. Instead, she let the silence stretch. Eventually, Thora banked the fire and laid out her bedroll. Stay if you wish, she said simply. I will keep watch. I've grown used to short sleeps. Catelyn nodded her thanks, curling on the ground in her cloak. She kept the small knife close at hand. Though Thora had saved her, she would not let her guard down. Even so, exhaustion soon claimed her, and she slipped into a restless slumber filled with twisted dreams. In the morning, Thora shared more water and some dried apples. I head east, she said. There's a holdfast rumored to be friendly, or at least not wholly under Frey control yet. You're welcome to ride with me as far as the next crossroad. Safety in numbers. Catelyn weighed the offer. Traveling with a swordswoman who had proven herself capable might be the best chance she had to avoid more brigands. I accept, she said quietly, and so they set forth, with Thora leading her horse on foot and Catelyn walking beside. During their journey, Thora asked few questions. Now and then, she would remark on how the war had turned the roads to chaos, or she'd ask if Catelyn had any living family. Catelyn would lie or offer vague answers. She found Thora was adept at reading tracks, alert to hidden threats. They skirted a pair of outlaws at one point, crouching in the bushes until the men passed by. They gleaned rumors from passing travelers about Frey outrages, lootings, hangings, and hunts for straggling northern soldiers. Catelyn's lips pressed tight at the news, her desire for vengeance growing with each horror she heard. On the third day of their companionship, they came upon a small village near the banks of the Red Fork. The houses were half burned, and the air stank of rot. Evidently, the place had been raided, perhaps by bandits or ravaging soldiers. In the center of what had once been a square, they found a handful of corpses strung up in a grotesque display. Thora's face hardened, and Catelyn felt bile rise in her throat. The meager folk who remained hid behind shuttered windows, peering out fearfully. They found an old inn with a caved-in roof, but the main floor was intact enough to offer shelter from the scorching sun. Thora tethered her horse in what remained of the stable. They scrounged for any salvageable supplies in the wreckage of the inn's kitchen, finding only some dried peas and a half-broken pot. While Thora tried to see if the well still yielded clean water, Catelyn crept upstairs, picking her way over fallen beams and shattered furniture. She found what must have once been the innkeeper's quarters, a small, ransacked room with drawers pulled out and tossed aside. Something glinted near a toppled dresser, and she stepped closer to see. It was a battered hairbrush with a carved wooden handle. She picked it up, memory flooding her. She recalled how she used to brush Sansa's hair each evening, how her daughter would hum a little tune. A wave of grief nearly brought her to her knees. She clutched the brush to her chest, tears burning her eyes. For so long, she had been running on numb determination. Now, in the quiet ruin, the memory of her lost children, her lost life, overwhelmed her. If she had been able to keep them all safe, if she had only done things differently. But regrets could change nothing. The tears dried swiftly, replaced by that old familiar fury. She had to keep going. She set the brush on the dresser, not wanting to carry more than essential items. She made her way back downstairs. Thora was walking back from the well with 2 buckets. She glanced at Catelyn's face and said nothing, but her expression softened slightly. They spent a cold night in the half-ruined inn, listening to the wind whistle through the gaping holes in the ceiling. Catelyn lay awake, her mind turning over the same questions. How could she exact vengeance on the Freys? Did she dare seek her uncle Brynden at Riverrun? Perhaps join forces with whatever pockets of resistance remained? But Riverrun was besieged. She had no illusions about strolling in unchallenged. By the time dawn broke, Catelyn decided that heading west, deeper into Frey territory, was suicide. She needed allies, or at least information. If the Brotherhood without banners was still roaming the Riverlands, perhaps they would be a natural ally. They had once fought for the common folk, and they had no love for the Lannisters or their Frey allies. She remembered hearing about them when traveling with Robb's army, rumors of a lightning lord who couldn't die. She did not know how much was truth or fancy, but it was a lead. The next morning, Thora emerged from behind the inn, leading her horse. She regarded Catelyn with a steady gaze. "I go south," she said simply. "Past the crossroads. Then I'll skirt around Harrenhal if I can. There's talk of Sellsword companies there, men who might hire an extra blade." Catelyn realized this was the moment to part ways. "You saved my life," she said. "I owe you a debt." Thora shrugged. "I kill men who need killing. It's my code." A faint smile touched her lips. "But if you want to repay me, keep yourself alive. Or kill 3 more men like those brigands. That'd do." An unexpected warmth stirred in Catelyn's chest. She nodded. "I'll do my best." They clasped forearms, and Thora mounted her horse. Before she left, she leveled a final look at Catelyn. "Listen, Cat. We all have secrets, but a word of advice. If your secret is as big as I suspect, watch yourself. The phrase don't let grudges lie." With that, she spurred her horse into a canter, leaving Catelyn alone in the ruined village. She lingered a while, gleaning what morsels of supply she could. Then, with the sun high overhead, she set out northward, aiming to circle around to the east bank of the Trident. She prayed for a sign, a direction, something to lead her to those who still resisted. As she walked, she found herself whispering names under her breath. Ned, Robb, Sansa, Arya, Bran, Rickon. They were her anchor, the reason she refused to lay down and die. Days passed. She glimpsed Frey banners more than once, small patrols mostly. Once, she hid in a drainage ditch for hours while a mounted column passed, sporting the twin towers of House Frey on their surcoats. She recognized some of the faces, men who had once feasted in her father's halls. Now they rode as traitors, betrayers of guest right, murderers. Her blood boiled, but she kept still as a stone. Patience, she told herself. They would meet their justice. She came upon a ragged encampment near an abandoned orchard, hoping to find travelers or outlaws who might share news. Instead, she was greeted by the chilling sight of bodies on pikes. A crude sign read, "Traitors to Walder Frey." She retched in the grass, the bitterness of her defeat flooding her again. The Freys were stamping out rebellion wherever they found it, leaving fear and horror in their wake. She took to traveling by night when the roads were deserted. She slept in hidden hollows during daylight. Each time she found a farmstead or cluster of huts, she assessed if it was safe to approach. Most places were deserted, burned, or stripped of all supplies. She grew thinner and weaker until her cheeks were hollow and her eyes sunken. She forced herself on, sustained by hatred and a mother's stubborn will. At length, she ventured near a place she remembered from her girlhood. A shallow cave set in a hillside above a small stream. It was not far from the place known as High Heart, though rumor said that was haunted by ghosts of ancient times. She chose to rest in the cave, thinking it secure. That night, a storm rolled in with fierce winds and pelting rain, but she was sheltered from the worst of it. She drifted in and out of a restless sleep. Sometime around midnight, she heard a scraping sound at the mouth of the cave. She jolted awake, reaching for her knife. A voice whispered, "There's someone in here." She saw faint torchlight reflected on wet stone, flickering shadows. Heart hammering, she considered whether to fight or flee deeper into the darkness. Then she realized the voice was a woman's, pitched low, not threatening. Another voice replied, "I. Hold the torch up. Let me see." Catelyn pressed herself against the rough wall, squinting in the dim light. She made out the shapes of 3 people, cloaked and hooded, huddled around a single torch. One stepped forward, holding the torch high. Their faces were partially shadowed, but she glimpsed a ragged man with a short beard, a woman with a scar across her chin, and a younger man with nervous eyes. Catelyn's heart pounded. She did not speak. Perhaps if they saw only a lone woman, they would leave her be. But the man with the beard raised his hands, showing they were empty. "We mean no harm. We only seek shelter from this cursed rain." The woman with the scar inclined her head. "You're alone? We saw your footprints outside." Catelyn's voice was rough. "I am alone. I have no quarrel with you." The younger man stepped forward, peering at her. "7 hells," he muttered. "She's half dead. Look at her in rags. She might be one of the lost." The bearded man frowned. "What's your name, my lady?" He used the term "my lady" more out of courtesy than actual recognition. She cleared her throat. "Call me Cat," she said. "You? Who are you?" They exchanged glances, and the man said, "Ro is my name. This is Helly," he gestured to the scarred woman. "And that's Pate." Helly took in Catelyn's gaunt face. "We have a bit of saltfish, maybe some bread. You're welcome to share if you let us stay here until dawn." Catelyn was not in a position to refuse, not when she was starving. She nodded warily. "We can share the space, so long as you keep the peace." They shook off their soaked cloaks. Catelyn noticed none wore sigils. They could be outlaws or displaced smallfolk. But something about them hinted at desperation mixed with a certain camaraderie. They offered her a scrap of fish. She ate slowly, forcing her stomach to handle the sudden gift of food. Meanwhile, the 3 strangers built a small fire in the cave's mouth, careful to keep it from the rain. Once they were settled, Ro explained in hushed tones that they were once farmers and a miller's apprentice, but the war had destroyed their homes. They'd fallen in with a band of outlaws at one point, stealing from fry wagons to survive. But that band was scattered by fry soldiers, leaving only these 3. They were searching for the brotherhood without banners, hoping to join. Catelyn's gaze sharpened. "The brotherhood? Does it still roam the Riverlands?" Helly shrugged. "Rumor says so. Word is they hide in secret camps, striking at Lannister or Fry patrols whenever they can. Some say Lord Beric is dead for good this time. Others say he still lives. No one knows for certain, but if they're out there, we'll find them. Better to fight with them than starve alone." A spark of possibility lit in Catelyn's mind. If the Brotherhood was still active, they might be the allies she needed to enact vengeance. She said, "I once heard they protected the small folk." Ro gave a humorless chuckle. "Aye, they try. Hard times for that now, with Freys combing every corner. But maybe the Lightning Lord or Lady Stoneheart is still leading them." Catelyn stiffened. "Lady Stoneheart? It's just a rumor," Pate said quietly, his eyes on the fire. "They say there's a woman with a scarred face who took up Beric's mantle after he died. She's merciless, they say, hanging any Fry or Lannister man she finds. Some say she's the corpse of a noble lady come back to life. Others say she's Beric's widow or sister or something. No one knows for sure, but it's said she hates the Freys more than the stranger himself does." Catelyn's mouth ran dry. A rumor of a vengeful woman leading the Brotherhood, rumored to be a dead noble? Had the story twisted from some glimmer of truth about her? Or perhaps it was only an invention of the fearful. Either way, it unsettled her. She forced herself to sound merely curious. "What else have you heard?" Helly shrugged. "That she never speaks because her throat was cut. That she's a ghost. That if she points at you, you're a dead man. All sorts of nonsense, likely. But what matters is that some group is out there killing Freys." Killing Freys. The words resonated in Catelyn's mind, stirring the black anger that coiled around her heart. She decided that if such a band truly existed, she would find them. She would lend them her hatred, her knowledge of the phrase, her thirst for retribution. She was not sure if she believed in ghosts or undead leaders, but the idea that someone out there shared her vendetta brought a grim sense of purpose. They passed the night exchanging bits of rumor and speculation. In the darkest hours, Helly and Ro nodded off, leaving Pate to stoke the coals. Catelyn lay awake, listening to the rain spatter. Her thoughts churned. The memory of the red wedding pressed on her like a weight. She pictured Walder Frey's contemptible grin, the crossbowmen perched overhead, the way they had slaughtered her boy. She clenched her fists until her nails bit into her palms. If there was a chance to strike back, she would seize it. When dawn came, the four parted ways. Catelyn asked to travel with them for a short while, feigning an interest in finding the Brotherhood. She gave no hint that her reasons were deeper than simple survival. Helly and Ro agreed, seeming to trust her well enough. They reasoned that 4 travelers had a better chance than 1 or 3, so they made their way eastward, skirting major roads, avoiding patrols. At first, their search for the Brotherhood felt futile. None they asked had more than scraps of rumor. A few insisted the Brotherhood was long gone, scattered or dead. Others claimed they had seen men in hoods passing through the woods at night, leaving no footprints behind. Another told of a Fry patrol found hanged near a roadside, the mark of outlaws. The stories contradicted each other, but Catelyn took hope in each rumor of fresh Fry corpses. As they traveled, Catelyn tried to keep her identity hidden. She was careful not to speak of the Tullis or the Starks. If Helly and Ro had any suspicions, they did not voice them. Hunger and the threat of violence overshadowed questions of birthright. They came across more ravaged farms, saw crows picking at the remains of battles old and new. Catelyn's soul felt heavier with every league. Then, one evening as they cut through a dense patch of forest, they heard the sound of hooves and hushed voices. Ro motioned for them to hide behind the thick undergrowth. Moments later, 3 men on horseback rode into view, each wearing patched leather and carrying bows. Their faces were concealed by scarves. One called out, "We know you're there. Show yourselves." Helly cursed under her breath, but rose slowly, hands open. Catelyn and the others followed suit. The riders regarded them coolly, arrows knocked but not loosed. "You're in Brotherhood territory," one rider said. "State your purpose." Ro spoke up, "We want to join if you'll have us. We share your enemies." The second rider, a taller man with a gray-streaked beard under his scarf, tilted his head. "How do we know you aren't Fry spies?" Helly scowled. "Look at us. We've got nothing. The Freys robbed our homes. We want revenge, not coin." The riders conferred softly. Then the first one said, "We'll take you to the Hollow Hill. You'll stand before Our Lady. If she judges you worthy, you'll remain. If not..." He let the words hang. Our Lady. Catelyn felt her heart skip. So the rumors were true? Had Beric Dondarrion truly yielded command to a mysterious woman of vengeance? Or was she about to come face to face with a charlatan using a name that struck fear in men's hearts? In tense silence, Catelyn and her companions were made to walk while the riders flanked them, guiding them deeper into the forest. The undergrowth thickened, branches scraping at their arms and faces. The setting sun cast long shadows through the canopy. Eventually, they arrived at a narrow crevice that led to a hidden cave mouth. Torches flickered inside. They were ushered within, the riders keeping a watchful eye. A network of caverns opened up, lit by scattered torches and braziers. They could see other outlaws in the shadows, men and women with hardened faces. At the far end of the largest cavern, a rough-hewn seat of stone stood, draped in tattered banners. One was the sigil of House Baratheon with the red heart of the Lord of Light scrawled over it, half-burned. Another was a direwolf's head, black on gray, shredded and stained. A third was the flaming heart of the Brotherhood. In that seat sat a figure swathed in a dark cloak, hood pulled low. Catelyn's pulse thundered. Could this truly be Lady Stoneheart? If so, what was she? Truly? They were made to kneel. Catelyn complied, feeling the damp cold of the cavern floor through her threadbare clothes. The torchlight flickered across the hooded figure's face, revealing hints of pale, leathery skin, a jawline marred by scars, thin lips that looked almost decayed, a sinew of deep red across the throat. Every detail made Catelyn's blood run cold. This was no ordinary woman. She carried death with her, an aura of menace that was palpable. One of the riders proclaimed, "We bring these travelers for judgment, my lady. They claim they seek to fight the Freys." The hooded figure said nothing. Instead, she lifted a hand, the skin pulled taut like old parchment. Her fingernails were cracked and dark. She pointed first at Helly, who shivered but remained silent, then at Ro and Pate in turn. Finally, that pale hand leveled at Catelyn, lingering there. Catelyn's heart pounded. She could not see the woman's eyes beneath that hood, but she felt their scrutiny like a knife's edge. She swallowed, trying to calm herself. A man standing beside the hooded figure spoke, his voice echoing in the cavern. "Our Lady wishes to know who you are, from where you come, and why you would join our cause." Helly spoke first, stammering out a short tale of how she and Ro and Pate had lost their homes to the Freys, how they had wandered in search of the Brotherhood's rumored safe haven. Ro concurred, explaining that they had stolen from a Frey caravan to survive. The man who served as the woman's mouthpiece nodded, apparently satisfied. Then it was Catelyn's turn. She tried to steady her voice. "I am called Cat. The Freys slaughtered my son's companions. They took everything I had. I want vengeance. Let me fight them with you." The hooded woman leaned forward slightly. In the torchlight, Catelyn glimpsed what looked like a ragged tear across the figure's neck, as though someone had cut her throat. She felt ice in her veins. The eyes beneath that hood. Could they see her face? Truly see her? A hush fell. The man who was apparently the interpreter for Lady Stoneheart turned to Catelyn. "Come closer," he said softly. She rose on unsteady legs, her mind whirling. Could it be that this was some spectral version of herself, some twisted rumor given form? Or was she about to face a monstrous creature born of the darkest magic? Stepping forward, she knelt again before the dais, her head bowed. The hooded figure reached out a hand and grabbed Catelyn's chin, lifting her face. The stench of decay assaulted Catelyn's nostrils. She fought the urge to recoil. She found herself gazing into the shadowed recesses of the hood, heart pounding. The figure's grip was surprisingly strong, the nails biting into Catelyn's skin. Then she released her with a jerk, pushing her back. Catelyn drew a ragged breath, not sure what had transpired. The man cleared his throat. "Our Lady says you may stay. You will prove your loyalty by fighting in our raids, by shedding Frey blood. Should you falter or betray us, you will die." Relief and something else, was it dread? Washed over Catelyn. She bowed her head. "I understand." Helly, Ro, and Pate were quickly led away by a pair of outlaws to be shown where they could sleep. But as Catelyn rose to follow, the man gestured for her to wait. "Our Lady wishes to speak with you alone." 1,000 questions collided in her mind. She stepped aside as the others left. The hooded figure remained on the stone seat, silent and unmoving until they were alone. The man who served as her interpreter stood at her side, arms crossed. Then Lady Stoneheart lifted her hand and motioned for him to depart. He gave a small bow and retreated, leaving Catelyn alone with this ominous presence. The cavern walls flickered with dancing shadows, the silence broken only by the dripping of water somewhere in the darkness. Slowly, Lady Stoneheart lifted both hands to lower her hood. Catelyn braced herself, expecting a ghastly sight. And it was indeed ghastly. The woman's hair hung in rotted clumps. Her skin was mottled and grayish. The cut across her throat was a vicious red line, partially sewn up but never truly healed. Her face, Catelyn's breath caught in her throat. She had never laid eyes on this woman before. Yet there was an unmistakable mark of tragedy in that ravaged visage, eyes that had seen death and returned. The corners of her mouth were twisted, as if she could not speak without pain. She seemed younger than Catelyn had imagined, but the lines of suffering aged her. She gestured for Catelyn to approach once more. Catelyn stepped forward, though her knees trembled. She tried to remind herself that she had come seeking vengeance, that these outlaws might be her best hope. But the presence of Lady Stoneheart, this rumored specter of retribution, unsettled her greatly. The woman raised a hand to her own neck, then pulled aside a bit of her cloak, revealing a necklace made of finger bones. Fry finger bones, perhaps. She let out a rasping exhalation, a sound that might have been a mockery of laughter or a tortured attempt at speech. Then she pointed at Catelyn's face, at the scars on her cheeks. Catelyn did not know what she wanted. Did she suspect that Cat was more than she seemed? The voice that came from the woman's throat was a wet gurgle, painfully forced. Catelyn could not make out words, only raw noise. After a moment, Lady Stoneheart sank back, her eyes never leaving Catelyn. Then she raised her hand and pointed to the sign of the direwolf banner, half hidden in shadow. She scraped a dirty nail along it and then pointed back at Catelyn. The meaning seemed plain enough. "Are you a friend of House Stark?" Catelyn swallowed hard. She gave the only answer her heart could. "Yes," she whispered. "I am." The woman inclined her head slowly, then pulled up her hood once more, hiding her ruined face. With a final gesture, she dismissed Catelyn from her presence. Catelyn backed away, her heart still pounding. Only once she was out of the cavern did she realize she was slick with sweat. She found a small nook near an unlit brazier, where Helly waited, expression curious. "What happened?" Helly asked. "She kept you longer than the rest of us." Catelyn shook her head. "I'm not sure," she lied. "She just wanted a closer look." Helly accepted the answer and soon guided Catelyn to where Ro and Pate were bedding down. None of them had much in the way of bedding, but at least the caves were drier than the forest. They were told that if they proved themselves in an upcoming raid, they would be considered full members of the Brotherhood. If they fell short, they might be cast out or strung up like traitors. It was a harsh initiation. In the days that followed, Catelyn found herself training with them, learning to move quietly in the woods, to use a bow if needed, though she was never skillful at it. She was better with a knife, taught by necessity. The outlaws kept a wary distance from her, as if sensing something about her was different, older, haunted. Yet they accepted her enough to share rations and watch her back. From the shadows, Lady Stoneheart observed everything. She rarely appeared among the rank and file, but rumor said she ventured out at night to personally oversee certain hangings. Catelyn wondered at the woman's true identity. She also wondered what that meant for her own quest. If Lady Stoneheart was so bent on vengeance against the Freys, would that not suit Catelyn perfectly? She need only align herself with the Brotherhood, use their raids to spill Fry blood. Yet some part of her yearned to do more than pick off patrols. She wanted to strike at the heart of House Fry, to see Walder Frey's smirk fade in terror before she cut it from his face. Still, for the moment, she had no choice but to follow orders. Her chance to repay the Freys in full would come, if she survived. Her first raid came at dusk, near a winding road where a Fry supply wagon was due to pass. Catelyn crouched behind a fallen log with Helly and Ro. They had stationed archers in the trees, while others lurked behind bushes on the far side. Catelyn's gut churned with anticipation. The plan was to disable the drivers, kill any Fry soldiers, and seize the supplies. They needed food, arms, and anything else that might help them continue their guerrilla war. At the appointed time, the wagon rattled into view. There were 4 men on horseback riding ahead, 2 drivers on the wagon seat, and another 2 men walking alongside. 7 men in total. Against them, the Brotherhood had at least a dozen outlaws hidden among the shadows, plus Lady Stoneheart watching from the ridge, if rumor was correct. A high-pitched bird call signaled the start. The archers loosed arrows, felling 2 men before they could draw swords. The rest shouted in alarm. Catelyn surged forward with Ro, their feet rustling through fallen leaves. One of the Fry men swung a sword at Ro, who parried clumsily. Helly sidestepped to drive her spear into the man's flank. Meanwhile, Catelyn found herself face to face with a young Fry soldier, perhaps no older than Robb had been when he first rode to war. The boy's eyes widened at the sight of her. She felt a moment of hesitation, thinking of how young he looked. But then she remembered Robb collapsing to the floor in the twins' hall, crossbow bolts sprouting from his chest, remembered the final spasm of life in her boy's limbs. Her rage burned away any pity. She feinted a low slash with her knife, then raked it across the soldier's wrist. He dropped his sword with a cry. She slammed her elbow into his jaw, knocking him back. He clutched his wrist, blood dripping. "Mercy, please," he gasped. "I didn't kill your king. I only—" She did not let him finish. Her knife flashed across his throat. A wet gurgle, and he fell. The savage satisfaction that roared through her veins caught her off guard. She barely recognized herself. But she did not stop. She wheeled around, spotting another Fry soldier who was tangling with an outlaw. The man's back was turned. Catelyn lunged, driving her blade between his ribs. He let out a choked cry and pitched forward. By then, the ambush was nearly over. The remaining Freys had either fallen or were disarmed. Roe and Helly stood panting, Helly's spear dripping blood. The drivers had surrendered, hands up, though one was wounded and moaning. A cheer rose among the Brotherhood. They had taken the wagon. The outlaws wasted no time rifling through the cargo. Barrels of salt pork, dried beans, and ale, precious supplies. Sacks of flour and cloth. The entire haul would keep them fed for weeks. Catelyn watched as the outlaws parted to allow a lone figure to step forward from the shadows. Lady Stoneheart. She glided across the scene like a specter, eyes roving over the dead Freys. Her gaze settled on the two drivers, kneeling and begging for mercy. They wore the livery of House Fry but had no swords. One sobbed, the other sullen. Lady Stoneheart's lips curled in distaste. She held out her hand, and one of her men placed a length of rope in it. Catelyn understood at once. These men would hang. She watched them struggle and plead. Part of her recoiled at the brutality. These men were only drivers, likely forced into service. But the deeper, darker part of her remembered the Red Wedding. How the Freys had not spared even her wounded boy or her loyal men. She did not intervene. The outlaws slipped the nooses around the men's necks, hauled them to a stout tree nearby. A rope was tossed over a thick branch. Catelyn closed her eyes for a moment as the men kicked and thrashed in the air, feet scrabbling. One let out a strangled cry. She thought of the lost honor of House Tully, the heartbreak of House Stark, the wickedness of Walder Frey. When she opened her eyes, the men were still, swaying gently on the rope. Lady Stoneheart turned away, her hood casting a dark shadow over her face. No one spoke as the outlaws finished loading the wagon with the spoils they wished to keep. They set fire to what they could not carry, not wanting the Freys to reclaim it. Then they vanished into the forest like ghosts, leaving the macabre display behind. That night, as they feasted on stolen ale and pork, Helly raised a cup to Catelyn. "You fought well," she said. "You have some skill with that knife." Catelyn said nothing, merely inclined her head. She felt numb, her mind replaying the sight of blood spurting from the throats she had cut. Though these acts fueled her vengeance, a small corner of her soul quailed at how easy it had become. Once, she had been a lady of honor, a mother who strove to protect her children. Now she was a killer in the shadows, spurred on by hate. But she reminded herself, it was House Frey's betrayal that had wrought this change. If they had shown honor, if they had not slaughtered her son and his men under guest right, she would never have resorted to this. They had taught her the lesson of cruelty. They had unleashed this rage. Let them reap what they had sown. In the weeks that followed, she participated in more raids. Each time, Lady Stoneheart was there, silently surveying, dealing out terrible judgment to any Fry who fell into her grasp. The woman seemed to sense Catelyn's cold fury. Occasionally, their eyes would meet across a battlefield or camp, as if Stoneheart was measuring the darkness in Catelyn's soul. And that darkness grew. Catelyn learned to push away the grief whenever it threatened to overwhelm her, instead channeling it into a fierce determination. She trained with spear and sword, though her skill was limited. She was more adept at stealth infiltration. The Brotherhood quickly realized she had the bearing of one born to command, though they did not guess her true station. She gleaned intelligence about Fry movements, recognized the names of certain Fry lords and their likely routes. As her reputation for cunning and ferocity spread among the outlaws, she found that none dared question her presence. She was simply Cat, the silent woman with scars on her cheeks, who had lost everything and fought with unwavering resolve. At nights, she lay awake on her bedroll in the depths of the caves, thinking of Winterfell's crumbling walls, of Ned's bones, of Robb's last breath. Sometimes she would weep silently, tears sliding down her face, but she never let anyone see. Word began to spread that House Bolton was sending men south to assist the Freys in securing the Riverlands. At that, Catelyn's hatred burned anew. Roose Bolton had betrayed Robb as surely as the Freys had. He had driven a dagger into her boy's heart. If the Dreadfort men came, she wanted to be at the forefront of the fight, to see their pale banners drenched in blood. Then came a day when one of the Brotherhood scouts brought word of a target of great import. A Fry lord was traveling north with only a modest escort. Rumor had it that it was Lothar Fry, called Lame Lothar, an architect of the Red Wedding, second only to Walder Fry in cunning. Lothar was returning from King's Landing with new decrees or demands. If he could be captured or killed, it would send a message to the entire Fry clan. Excitement rippled through the Brotherhood's ranks. Lady Stoneheart convened her captains, men who had been with the group the longest. The plan was to ambush Lothar on a narrow stretch of road near a ravine. Archers would drive the guards into disarray, while a main force blocked the road from both ends. They would aim to take Lothar alive, so that Lady Stoneheart could mete out a more personal form of justice. Catelyn's pulse raced at the thought. Lothar Fry was a name she knew too well. He had been among those who welcomed them at the Twins, wearing a polite smile that masked his treacherous heart. He had played a key role in orchestrating the slaughter. If she could help kill him, it might soothe a fraction of her torment. But part of her wanted him alive first, so she could scream Robb's name in his face, demand he feel the terror her son had felt. The night before the ambush, Lady Stoneheart summoned Catelyn once more, silent as ever. They stood in a side cavern, torches guttering on the walls. The silent woman lifted a hand to trace the scars on Catelyn's cheeks, a surprisingly gentle gesture that made Catelyn flinch inwardly. Then Lady Stoneheart gestured to her own throat, the half-healed slash that had nearly severed her head. The words were gargled, incomprehensible, but the meaning was plain enough. She, too, knew betrayal, knew the agony of losing everything. Catelyn found herself murmuring, "I will avenge us both." She was not sure if the woman understood, but the hood dipped in a single nod. The next morning, they set out under cover of darkness to lie in wait. Catelyn's breath came quick as she crouched behind a stand of trees with Helly and 3 others. Across the road, Roe and a pair of archers were hidden among rocks. Further down, more outlaws were ready to block any retreat. They had prepared obstacles on the road, felled logs and concealed caltrops. Lothar's party would be forced into a bottleneck, easy prey for an ambush. They waited. The sun rose high, filtering through the leafy canopy. Catelyn's heart pounded in her ears. Then, at last, they heard distant hoofbeats and the clatter of wheels. She peeked around a trunk and saw a small entourage of riders, perhaps 8 men, plus a covered carriage pulled by 2 horses. That must be Lothar's conveyance, for he was known to have a twisted leg. A couple of outriders wore the Fry Twin Towers sigil. Perfect. At a signal from Roe, the archers let fly. 2 outriders went down. The rest shouted in alarm, drawing swords. The carriage driver frantically pulled on the reins, the horses whinnying in panic. Then the logs and caltrops came into view, blocking any forward escape. Men tried to turn, only to be met by the second wave of Brotherhood outlaws surging out of the forest. It was chaos. Steel clashed, arrows whirred, horses screamed. Catelyn hung back for a moment, scanning for Lothar. She saw the carriage door flung open, a portly man with a limp emerging, flanked by a pair of guards. Lothar's face was twisted with fury and fear. Catelyn's pulse hammered. She darted forward, weaving through the melee. A Fry guard lunged at her, but she ducked his slash and stabbed him in the kidney. He fell, groaning, her eyes fixed on Lothar, who was hobbling toward a horse, desperate to escape. Heli blocked his path, thrusting her spear, but one of his guards batted it aside. Lothar seized the horse's reins with trembling hands. Before he could mount, Catelyn hurled herself at him. Her momentum crashed into his side, knocking him off balance. He fell, cursing, his bad leg twisting beneath him. She landed on top of him, knife pressed to his throat. He stared up at her, eyes bulging. "Who?" he spat, but she cut him off by pressing harder. Blood beaded under the blade's tip. She wanted to scream that she was Catelyn Stark, mother of the king he betrayed. She wanted to rip his face open, see him beg, but a part of her remembered Lady Stoneheart's plan. He was to be taken alive for her vengeance. So Catelyn contented herself with pressing her knee onto his chest, letting him feel death's closeness. "Move and you die," she hissed. He went very still, eyes darting around for help. But the fight was nearly done. The Brotherhood had swiftly overwhelmed the escort. The carriage driver was dead, the outriders lying in the dirt. A few outlaws began tending to their own wounded. Others looted corpses. Heli approached, spear in hand. "Nicely done," she said, a savage grin on her face. Soon, a hush fell as Lady Stoneheart arrived on horseback, flanked by her personal guard. She dismounted stiffly, her cloak swirling around her skeletal frame. Her eyes locked onto Lothar Frey, and Catelyn felt him tremble beneath her. He recognized something in that figure, or at least recognized the hatred that blazed in those unearthly eyes. The outlaws jerked Lothar to his feet. He moaned, clutching his twisted leg. Lady Stoneheart produced a length of rope, then paused, as though considering. A murmur went through the ranks. Would they simply hang him here? But Stoneheart shook her head, pointing back to the concealed wagons they had brought. She wanted him taken to their lair, presumably for a more thorough end. Lothar began to babble, offering gold, offering a ransom, promising anything. His pleas fell on deaf ears. Catelyn glared at him. For a heartbeat, his eyes locked on hers, as though trying to place her. Her knuckles whitened on her knife. 1,000 images swirled through her mind. Ned's head on a spike, Robb gasping his last, her daughters stolen away, her home in ashes. She leaned close, speaking in a low voice only he could hear. "Remember the Red Wedding. Your crimes will be answered." A flicker of recognition lit his gaze, but it was too late for him to protest. With a savage twist, Heli and another outlaw bound his hands, gagged him and hauled him away. Lady Stoneheart turned, fixing Catelyn with that unreadable stare. Then she inclined her head in something resembling approval. Catelyn felt a grim satisfaction well inside her. They had caught one of the masterminds of the Red Wedding. The next step would be extracting every last ounce of pain from him. Walder Frey himself might remain safe behind the walls of the twins, but his brood could be whittled away, piece by treacherous piece, until he was left to rot in terror. The desire for vengeance was a bottomless well, and Catelyn realized, in that moment, that she had plunged headlong into its depths. If she had ever been the gentle lady of Winterfell or Riverrun, that woman was gone. The Red Wedding had shattered her heart, and what remained was sharpened by grief, hardened by rage. She would follow Lady Stoneheart's path of bloody retribution, if it meant wiping the Frey name from the face of the earth. She would stain her hands with as much blood as it took, because in this world, that was all that was left for her. And so began Catelyn Stark's dark campaign of revenge across the Riverlands. Lame Lothar was only the first of many to tremble at the whisper of the Brotherhood's hunts. Catelyn took no pleasure in the cruelty, only a fierce, bitter satisfaction that justice, in some form, was being done. If the gods would not deliver it, she would. She told herself it was for Robb, for Ned, for the children she had lost. But in quiet moments, she could not help wondering if she had become something unrecognizable, something monstrous. Yet each time that doubt crept in, she remembered the betrayal, recalled the sight of her son being butchered as music played. Mercy was a luxury, a relic of a world she no longer inhabited. Thus, she pressed on, a silent fury in her heart, a blade in her hand. She had lost her home, her husband, her son, but she had found a new purpose: to ravage the murderers who had taken everything from her. And with each new Fry or Bolton who fell under her knife, her legend in the Riverlands grew, not as the gracious Lady Catelyn Tully, but as a vengeful specter haunting the nightmares of traitors. She continued, day by day, night by night, forging deeper alliances with Lady Stoneheart's cadre, orchestrating ambushes, capturing Freys, ransoming some for coin, killing others as warnings. The Riverlands murmured of a swirling darkness that avenged the Stark name. And in the hush of dawn, when she washed blood from her hands in a forest stream, Catelyn would stare at her reflection and wonder if the soul gazing back was truly hers, or that of a wraith driven only by revenge. Still, she did not waver. Walder Frey had to pay. Roose Bolton had to pay. Their men, their allies, all who had participated in the Red Wedding must be brought to ruin. House Stark's name might be all but extinguished in the eyes of the realm, but so long as she drew breath, they would not be forgotten. She was Catelyn Stark, once of House Tully, mother of the king in the north. Her voice, once gentle and full of warmth, now spoke in a hoarse whisper of rage. Her hands, once used to guide her children, now wielded steel with deadly purpose. One day, she promised herself, she would stand before Walder Frey and see the fear in his watery eyes. She would let him beg as her son had begged for his life. Though Robb had never truly begged, he had simply died. Then she would show him no mercy. She would cast his lifeless body to the wolves, a final offering to the ghosts of Winterfell. And perhaps then, at last, Catelyn Stark could find some measure of peace, if any peace remained for those who tread the path of vengeance. But until that day, she walked forward, cloaked in the memory of her lost family and the promise of blood debt unpaid. The Red Wedding had been the moment her old self died. Now she was something else entirely, relentless, unyielding, a dark reflection of the mother she had been. The Riverlands whispered of her, though they did not know her name, only that a silent flame of vengeance burned among the outlaws. And as the ravens took flight across the war-torn skies, bearing rumors of this new terror for the Freys, Catelyn Stark pressed on, always forward, always deeper into the darkness, carrying the cause of her slaughtered son and the tattered pride of House Stark. Vengeance was her prayer now, and she would see it through to the bitter end, be it her own death or the annihilation of every Frey who had spilled innocent blood at the twins. No matter the cost,